Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Today, we're going to be looking at post war America, ultimately the 15 years following World War II, and get a better sense of how American life today came to be. The America that you know today really has its origins in 1945, and the decisions that the government makes, but also much of the rebuilding that needs to take place globally following World War II will give rise to what many people call the American dream. The question we're going to debate is, well, was this for all people and why wasn't it? So, just to give you some vital statistics, if we are looking at the time period between 1940 and 1960, so ultimately the eve of World War II, just coming out of the Great Depression, and compare that with 12 years of economic growth following World War II, you can really see that there's a huge difference in things like full-time income is nearly three, if not four times what it was in 1940. Today, your parents would be excited if they were making four times as much money as they were 12 years ago. We're not seeing quite that level of increase in the 2020s. But you can also see when we break it down for other groups, a rail worker would have been somebody who was probably union affiliated but had no college education. And a union worker is making about the same amount of what would have been someone who had the education and business of being like a dentist in 1940. So what we're seeing is what unions wanted. They wanted to see that you could have a middle class income working in manufacturing, and they certainly get that by the mid 1950s. If we're going to compare female workers to male workers, the best way to do that is comparing the rail worker to the income of the nurse, because this was a predominantly female profession in the 1940s, and certainly even by the end of the 1950s. Her income is about half of what a male union worker was. So we certainly see some discrepancies in pay based on gender. We're going to see some other good things as well, even though we do have some inflation. So a pound of bread cost you less than 10 cents in 1940, and it's costing you just shy of 20 cents in 1957. That's about a double increase, or slightly a little bit more than maybe 60%. But if your income has literally increased 180%, that's not such a bad rate of inflation. You can also see in the 1940s, we basically weren't keeping track of how many families owned automobiles. We certainly are doing that as we begin the 50s. And you can see that a family owning at least one car, that's 75% of the American population, which will also give rise to some other demographic changes in this time period. So one of the things College Board wants you to make sure that you're aware of is that there are some similarities between the 1920s and the 1950s. Obviously, both are decades following world wars. They both have Red Scares. We're also going to see prosperity for the white middle class in both periods. You're also going to see that as a whole, white populations in the United States, which was about 86% of the population in total, are going to see, as you saw in the previous slide, a tremendous increase in their wages. And with that increase in wages, then we can have an increase in consumption. You're also going to see that just like the 20s, you have a youth culture with parents with disposable incomes, and that we can again continue to keep childhood going for a much longer period of time than people did at the beginning of the 20th century. We've got new music, the jazz of the 20s. Many of the similar instruments and rhythms were going to find themselves in a new form called rock and roll in the 1950s. And the new media of the 1920s, it was the radio in every household. In the 1950s, it will be television. So, post World War II is a time of great prosperity. You're also going to see some demographic changes. So, starting after World War II, you begin to see the formation of what people call the nuclear family. And that does not have a connection to atomic testing or the development of weaponry following World War II. It's about the idea that you have essentially two generations within a household. You have mom and dad, and you have children. And that family is going to live more and more so out in the suburbs. These are not the suburbs of an earlier era that were connected to rail lines, some sort of mass transit. These are going to be new areas where the automobile is going to be what drives dad to and from work each day, moving the kids around via mom. This is a new space, and it's going to be a place that, much like the ideology of the 1840s and 1850s, we are going to be able to create a family sphere that is removed from work. It can be removed from sort of the unpleasantness of modern life. It can be idyllic, and that was the idea behind it. So it's interesting because really we get two themes in the 1950s. We get one of prosperity and also of conformity, very much a return to traditional gender roles. And we saw quite a bit of this after World War II, after World War I, as women went from the factory back home. We see it again after World War II. And people are going to be trying to fulfill an American dream through material consumption. And to give those people a break, let's consider who these people would have been. If you were 25, 30 years old with young children in the mid 1950s, you had spent your childhood through the Great Depression and your young adulthood in World War II. And imagine knowing poverty and struggle and chaos, and for many people, a firsthand look at death and destruction. You'd want to prevent your children from having to experience any of that. And we often refer to the people who fought and kept America going during World War II, and obviously were young people during the Great Depression. They become eventually labeled as the greatest generation, and they are the generation who gives rise and raises the boomers. And we make fun of the boomers today. But the boomers are the boomers because the greatest generation, they had lived through suffering and loss, and now had the attempt to give this to their own children. And we can certainly look at, what other social problems that may give rise to. But ultimately, this material consumption was a way in which people thought they were providing and protecting and giving the best opportunities and best life to their children. The US had no real Western industrial production competition until the 1960s, especially mid to late 1960s. And so there were jobs aplenty because the world needed to be rebuilt, and the United States was going to do it. We will have full employment for more than a decade. And what that means is less than 4% of the population needs a job, wants a job. It's also the height of unions. And so you are going to see more and more people who can enter the middle class. And this is October, 6 months really following the end of World War I in Europe. And you can see the nuclear family here and the cornucopia that liberty has brought of all the material things. These were things that they had once heard of, wanted, and they can now have now that the war is over. Sometimes we refer to the 50s as the nifty 50s. And obviously, we're only looking at the positives when we use that label. But science and technology is going to boom. And that is a pattern seen throughout human history, that you have a large, prolonged period of warfare. Out of that warfare, well, usually we come up with all kinds of scientific developments. We may come up with new ways of organizing ourselves, and that benefits the people to come. So broadcast television, although introduced in the 1930s as the television, there were not the networks to broadcast and do programming. However, by the late 1940s, that will come to be. And yes, that is a television, circa 1950. We're going to see some products that were created during World War II, something like Teflon, um, oral antibiotics. So antibiotics and their use in medical purposes is going to come to be during World War II and save a lot of lives. It's going to have the impact of very much increasing life expectancy for the next 7, 8 generations to come. But we're also going to see the development of things like oral contraception, so being able to delay parenting for an extended period of time. The polio vaccine, polio ravaged the country in cycles of about every 10 to 15 years. And that eventually, by the late 1950s, no longer be a large killer of children in the same way that things like measles were also before vaccinations. But modern computing will be born in this time period. So the computer language of Fortran, the modem, the microchip, the integrated circuit, all of these things are born in the 50s. Obviously, they're not going to be utilized to the efficacy that we can today. That's really going to take until the 1980s, 1990s. But the groundwork has been laid. And especially when it comes to programs like NASA, what we're going to see at places like Bell Labs, you're going to see eventually sort of the world that we live in today is going to have its origins in the 50s. And also the solar cell. It's not going to be incredibly efficient. I think it had like 6% efficiency back in the early 50s when it's developed. I think we're somewhere at about 20%. So we're still working on that. But what could later be used in terms of green initiatives and new energy sources will also begin to be developed in the 50s. Also, pop culture. So popular culture exists again really with every generation of human history, but the consumptive quality of pop culture, we certainly saw that in the 1920s, and we're going to see a return to it in the 1950s. And some of the items on my screen may be familiar to you, like Elvis and Chuck Berry. You may know Mr. Potato Head. Back in the day, Mr. Potato Head, you provide the potato. But the idea that we have plastic, that we have all kinds of toys for children, we can extend childhood, and parents have money to entertain children, that children can exist in this space where they're entertained and have fun, and they don't really have to even begin to consider adulthood until at least age 18, if not later. But many of the childhood toys that you're familiar with today, like Play-Doh, come to be in the 50s. The situation comedy on television as a form of entertainment will take roots in the 50s as well. And one of the things to consider, too, is what are people watching on TV? They are watching the antics of the nuclear family. So Lucy and her husband, they will have children during the course of the storyline of I Love Lucy. This is the family from Leave It to Beaver. Everybody's happy. There's seldom ever a problem. If there's a problem, it can be solved in 22 minutes. This becomes normalized for a lot of people, for better or worse. We're also going to get expertise about all sorts of things, including child rearing. For many moms of the 1950s, the manner in which they raised their children was to take on the expertise of a man named Dr. Spock. And this is going to be a childhood where people are encouraged to not yell at their children, to let children make mistakes, but also understand the boundaries within which they live, that church and religious life is still going to have an important role for a lot of people, and that there are norms to be embraced. And this traditional nuclear family of mom and dad, 2.3 children, is certainly a big part of that. Domestically, we've talked about Truman in terms of foreign policy following World War II. He's going to have his hands full at home as well. One of the things that he and others who worked in government realized is that in the 1920s, although we saw great prosperity, there was a lot of turmoil in 1919, 1920, 1921. Trying to make this transition from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy. And so the government this time wanted to have a much better plan. And also, since the growth of government and the New Deal, they were actually empowered to have more influence than they would have had at an earlier time. So Truman is going to focus on an idea called reconversion, and that's where we take our wartime economy and we step by step bring it back to a peacetime economy, hopefully not impacting people negatively. So there is going to be a tax cut. Americans had a lot of savings from World War II because there was so much rationing, but Americans were employed either in war industries, the military itself, or perhaps they just had a regular job. There were people who still had those. They have tons of money to spend. And so we want to encourage them to spend it as much as possible. Part of reconversion is also taking that young male population, most of which was under 25, that went and fought in World War II, and giving them an option besides simply going back to the factory or to the farm. What becomes known as the GI Bill was important because ultimately it provided money for young people to go to college. So you had young men who had fought in World War II, and if they chose not to go to college, they at least could get low interest home loans. And so if they had a job, they now had the ability to start a family. And that is going to be a big piece of what contributes to predominantly white prosperity following World War II. We are going to see inflation. And there's actually pretty high inflation between 1945 and 1947 because, again, we have lots of people with money, but we have a limited number of goods. And if you have a lot of money chasing a finite number of goods, well, those goods become more and more valuable, and so the price goes up. So trying to control that. There were also a lot of labor strikes. The United Auto Workers, the AFL, their wages early on is not going to keep pace with this inflation. We're also going to see that women and minorities who wanted to keep working really didn't have that option because some of those social factors that we saw in the 20s, this idea that the workplace, whether that's in manufacturing or it's in what are white collar jobs, this is not the work for women and other minorities. And so for those who still wanted or had to continue working, you're going to see a return to the domestic work for African Americans predominantly and pink collar jobs for women. So secretarial work. But Truman's also going to work on some different things in order to try to provide what is essentially a carryover, a continuum of what existed with the New Deal. His one concern was that you would have prosperity and ultimately the US government would say all that had been done with the New Deal should go away. And Truman felt that there were people who needed and would continue to need support. So expansion of Social Security, a raise in the minimum wage, which had not happened since it had been created in 1936. He also proposed universal health care. There was a national health service that had taken form in the United Kingdom. He thought the US should probably offer something similar. That will never come to be. He also is going to build upon what was the Fair Employment Practices program that was created by executive order by his predecessor, FDR, and it's going to become now a law. And FEPA is important because it's what is still utilized today in terms of hiring. And although you see a lot of people being encouraged to leave the workforce if they are minorities or women, certainly we've seen in the last 40 years both groups utilizing this as a means to better pay and better treatment in the workplace. Also, the first public housing will be built in this time. So throughout all the programs of the New Deal, housing was not one of those things that the New Deal got into. They certainly helped banks secure loans in order to encourage people to renovate homes and buy homes. But the idea that there would actually be public housing, that'll be created during Truman's time. He's also going to be looking at ways to protect the country, but also to improve our economic standing elsewhere. So the St. Lawrence Seaway which is another canal system that connects Canada and the United States, will be built. Atomic energy will also be nationalized. There was great fear that in developing the nuclear program, that you would have private industry suddenly wanting to get involved with that in some way. And that was something that Congress and Truman said needed to definitely be taken out of the hands, ever potentially, of private industry. By 1948, the Democratic Party, which has been entrenched, controlled both houses of Congress and the presidency since 1932, is going to find itself having less and less power. The Republican Party will win both houses in 1948. And so Truman will face something that FDR never did, which is a Congress of an opposite party. And you will see a lot of conservative measures come to be as a result, including the Taft-Hartley Act, which creates a phenomenon we still have in the United States today, which is some states are what we call right-to-work states. They are states in which individuals do not have to belong to unions, and certainly over the last 50 years, we have seen the power that unions have waned both economically and legally. But Taft-Hartley took away the practice of closed shops. Again, a closed shop is when you have to belong to the union to have the job. And that goes away in 1948. So unions are still going to continue to exist, and ultimately, why there are far fewer today, that's going to come because of the economic changes, moving from a manufacturing to a service economy, but not until the mid to late 1960s. Truman takes over the reins from FDR in 1944 with only a few months on the job as vice president. He has to close out World War II. He is in charge at the beginning of the Cold War. He's got to be responsible for taking an economy that has not known prosperity in peacetime for more than 20 years and somehow turn it into a new America. And there's challenges with that. And he's going to find that even in his own party, there are people who felt Truman was too liberal. Truman saw the need to help the underclass. He also said that African Americans had committed so much throughout the history of the United States, but certainly in World War II, and that the armed forces needed to be integrated. And he issues Executive Order 9981 to do that as the commander-in-chief, again, because he did not believe the Congress at that time would actually pass a law to do this. But this was the first step in what will become a massive shift in the Democratic Party in 1948. Truman says, he's, the candidate for re-election because he is the sitting president. But the party has to understand that he insists on a civil rights plank. He says it must be contained within the language of the Democratic Party platform that there will be equality in all areas of American life for African Americans. And this will actually cause the Democratic Party to split. It's part of the reason why we will see Republicans win in 1952 with Dwight D. Eisenhower, not just because of his resume and military experience in the height of the Cold War, but also because whites, particularly in the South, are going to defect the Democratic Party. So people who would have been white Southerners who would not have ever voted Republican before because it had been the party of Lincoln for so long are going to change their minds because they don't feel with this initiative, the civil rights plank, they can vote Democrat anymore. So some will just become Republican voters. Others will become part of a third party called the Dixiecrats, which was run by Strom Thurmond of South Carolina. He'll be their first presidential candidate. If that name sounds familiar, the Student Center at USC in Columbia is the Strom Thurmond building. He was, for a very long time, the longest continuously elected U.S. Senator. He will have great power for over 5 decades and influence in the United States Senate. But he will, in 1948, become a third-party candidate. So Truman will prevail. He will manage to get reelected in 1948. Although, as you can see, he's holding a newspaper that says that the Republican candidate, Thomas Dewey of New York, has defeated him. But that was because of the polling up to the election had made it really close, and it looked like, hey, the Republicans might take over. But one of the things that Truman was able to do was convince the American people that he had been a good steward of FDR, but he also understood the future of the country. So the Democrats will hold on to the White House, although they will lose Congress in this election. So the 50s is always talked about as a time of prosperity. And as we're going to see in the next lesson, it is also the beginnings of a civil rights movement, which I will call the freedom movement, because that's really what it's going to be about. And social justice will still continue to have to be done for decades after. But one of the things that I think is important to understand is that when we look at the 50s, especially if we're looking through media constructions of it, television, cinema, even the newspapers of the day, we're very much seeing a white narrative. So it is an idyllic time in a lot of respects. But when we look at things like unemployment, median family income, home ownership rates, whites are going to outstrip Black families considerably. And unfortunately, these will be trends that will continue on for decades. So it is a time of prosperity. It is a time of conformity. But it's also going to be a time of continued prejudice. And just to give you some statistics, white families are about 86% of the population. More than half of them live in homes that they either own free and clear or have mortgages on. 80% of white families will own at least one car. More and more of them will go to live in suburbs. So they will leave urban centers to go to the Long Islands if they live in New York City, to go to the suburban neighborhoods in and around Detroit. But they're going to dislocate themselves from the cities of the past. And typically, there's a two-parent household with a mother who stays at home. For African Americans, we're going to see something slightly different, and in some cases, massively different. African Americans are about 19 million in terms of the total number of the population, which is about 12%. They are going to find that there is less and less work to be had, especially in urban areas in the 1950s. Only about a quarter of African Americans are going to own cars, and that's going to be a significant factor in the success of some of the early civil rights initiatives, especially when it comes to public transportation. Less than 10% own houses, and 60% of that 19 million continue to live in the South under Jim Crow. So we are seeing very much there are two Americas. And although the vast majority of Americans won't be impacted with things like redlining and homeowner restrictive covenants, these ones were established in 1935 in Charlotte. This is the neighborhood of Myers Park and its surrounding area. And one of the things that you will see throughout this period, starting with the Great Depression, but this will obviously impact home ownership really for the next 40 years to come, is that the Federal Housing Administration is going to look at neighborhoods across the country and begin to label them. And based on what part of the city you live in, and also what are the majority population in terms of ethnicity or race, is going to impact whether or not you can get a loan to buy a house there. And so what are predominantly African American neighborhoods? For the most part, one could not get financing to buy a home, or a business for that matter. But if you look, this list, I mean, based on preference in terms of who you can loan money to. These, again, were all created in the 1930s. Probably didn't impact so much of the population then, because in the mid-1930s, very few people had the money to buy homes. But by the mid-1950s, when a good portion of the population does, it will make a big difference. These also are some pictures of Charlotte in the 1950s. What you are looking at Here is a byproduct of what became 277. So as the interstate highway system was built, that Interstate 77, they built a loop around downtown. And in order to build that loop, much of downtown found itself being reorganized and restructured, including a predominantly African American neighborhood called Brooklyn, which is where Panther Stadium is today, basically what is North Tryon to College Street. But you do see the ever growing number of what are urban Black neighborhoods versus white suburban neighborhoods. Also, we talked about Mexican Americans in terms of the World War II at home, but we're also going to see that what had been a trend since the early 1940s, which was to bring Mexican labor to the United States, predominantly for agricultural work. In the 1950s, the Administration for Naturalization and Citizenship is going to go through and create a program that ultimately is to deport Mexican Americans, or really people of Mexican origin, because they're going to be US citizens who are going to be deported. The Mexican government says that they have a labor shortage and they don't want to release any more people of who are Mexican, and they would actually like to see a return of some of their people. And the United States sees that for every Mexican immigrant who is working, that could potentially be a job for someone else. And so, between those two countries, they're going to spend most of the mid 1950s deporting people. And yes, that name, Operation Wetback, is certainly racist in name. And certainly today, we look at it as a program that was set to essentially create less diversity within the American population. But remember, most of the people who had come, they had come through the Braceros program. They were welcome workers for a time. But in 15 years after that program began, the US government and the Mexican government began to have a change of heart about the efficacy of that program, and it radically changed. But we're going to see throughout the 1950s and 60s a lot of upheaval in terms of populations, and we're going to start looking at populations within the United States. We've talked about the concept of sort of whiteness and what it means for immigrant populations, and we're going to continue to reflect upon that as we look at the 1950s and 60s. So we're going to stop here. As we close out, I have three statements for you. So the first one is, in the 1920s and 1950s, they were similar in that they were times of increased economic prosperity for all individuals at every income level. That would be false. We certainly see economic prosperity for lots of individuals in the 1950s and 1920s. It was very much a middle class prosperity. It was not a working class or underclass prosperity. But also in the 1950s, not all people were included in that prosperity. Number two, the Red Scare of the 1950s was based on Soviet influence in the United States and its government officials, while that of the 1920s was anti-immigrant in sentiment, and that is true. For number three, the youth music of the 1950s was like that of the 1920s in that it had roots in African American styles and rhythms, and that is also true. So just a little way for us to compare and connect those two decades together. Have a good day, and we'll see you next time.